The wagon was still burning when Nathaniel Pierce came over the ridge, and for a moment he thought the woman standing beside it was part of the smoke, a shape too straight and too still to belong to the wreckage around her, and it was only when she turned her head that he understood she was alive, and that the small boy pressed against her skirts was alive too, both of them coated in ash and neither of them crying, which struck him as wrong in a way he couldn't yet name, because children who have just watched something burn are supposed to cry, and this one only watched the flames with the flat patience of someone who had already run out of tears days ago. He came down off his horse slow, the way his mother had taught him to approach spooked cattle, and said nothing at first, just looked at the overturned buckboard, the scattered crates, the black seam of smoke rising into a sky already going orange with evening, and the woman said, before he could ask, "There's nothing left to steal, if that's what you're here for." And Nathaniel said he wasn't here for that. He was here because he'd seen smoke from his east pasture, and smoke this time of year usually meant trouble, and trouble usually meant somebody needed help whether they wanted to say so or not. Her name was Ruth Calder, she told him, though it took her a full minute to decide to give it, and the boy was Sam, 6 years old and silent in the particular way of children who have learned that silence keeps them safe. And when Nathaniel asked what happened, she looked at the burning wagon and said only that a wheel had gone bad on the grade and the lamp oil had done the rest, which was true as far as it went, though he would learn later it left out the parts that mattered. He had a house 4 miles south, he told her, with a good stove and a dry loft, and she could stay the night and decide her direction in the morning. And Ruth looked at him the way a woman looks at a man when she's had to make that calculation too many times already in her life, weighing the cost of trusting a stranger against the cost of a 6-year-old sleeping in open country. And she said she'd take the loft, but she'd pay her way. She wasn't a charity case, and Nathaniel said fine, though privately he had no idea what a woman with nothing but a burnt wagon and a silent child could possibly have wanted pay him with, and he found out the answer to that within 2 days, because on the second morning he came in from mending fence to find his kitchen rearranged in ways that made no sense until he tried to use it. The flour moved to where his hand actually reached instead of where his mother had left it 15 years earlier. The good knife sharpened for the first time since he couldn't remember when, and Ruth standing over a pot of something that smelled better than anything that stove had produced since his wife died, and when he asked how she'd learned to do all that she said her father had run a boarding house in Missouri, and she'd been cooking for 12 men since she was 9 years old, and there was a particular set to her jaw when she said it, the set of a woman who had spent her whole life being useful to people who never once asked if she wanted to be. And Nathaniel noticed that, the way he noticed most things about her that she didn't say directly, and he found he was noticing quite a lot. Sam, for his part, wouldn't come near the barn for 3 days, and when Nathaniel finally asked why, expecting some ordinary boyish fear of the animals, Ruth went quiet and then said, careful, that the fire that took their wagon hadn't been an accident of the road at all, that her husband's brother, Wallace Calder, had been trying to buy them off their claim for 2 years because there was a spring on it that never ran dry even in August, and when they wouldn't sell he'd taken to riding by at night, and 3 nights before the fire he'd stood in their yard and told her plainly that a widow with a boy couldn't hold land forever, and she hadn't believed he meant the wagon until the wagon was burning, and that was why Sam wouldn't go near dark enclosed spaces anymore, because the last one he'd been near had nearly killed him. Nathaniel took this in without much visible reaction, which was his way. But that night he sat up later than usual with a lamp and a ledger and didn't write anything in it, just sat, and in the morning he rode into Cedar Junction and came back with a lockbox and told Ruth, without much ceremony, that she and the boy could stay as long as they needed, that he had more house than one man required and more work than one man could finish, and that this wasn't charity either. It was a fair trade for a kitchen that finally made sense and a floor that finally got swept. And Ruth almost smiled at Boar. That, the first almost smile he'd seen from her, and said he drove a hard bargain for a man who didn't seem to want anything, and Nathaniel said he wanted plenty, he just wasn't in the habit of saying so out loud. The weeks that followed took on a shape neither of them planned, but both of them settled into without argument. Nathaniel out with the cattle from first light, Ruth running the house with the quiet thoroughness of someone who had never in her life been given the chance to run one properly, and Sam, slowly, unclenching, first following Nathaniel to the barn at a distance of 20 feet, then 10, then finally close enough that Nathaniel put a currying brush in his hand one morning, without asking whether he wanted it, only saying the mare liked a firm stroke and showing him how, and Sam did it. Wrong twice, and right the third time, and looked up with an expression Ruth caught from the porch and had to turn away from because she wasn't ready yet to let anyone see what that expression did to her chest. There were small things that built on each other, the way small things do when two careful people are learning to trust each other without saying the word trust. Nathaniel mending the strap on Sam's boot without being asked and leaving it by the door like it was nothing. Ruth noticing he favored his left shoulder after long days and starting to put the heavier tools on the right side of the workbench where he wouldn't have to reach across himself, neither of them remarking on it, both of them noticing that the other had noticed. And on an evening in October, with Sam asleep and the fire low, Ruth finally told him the rest of it, the part she'd left out on the ridge, which was that her husband Daniel hadn't died of fever like she'd let people assume. He'd died 3 weeks after Wallace first came around asking about the spring, thrown from a horse that had never once thrown him in 9 years of riding it, and the county coroner had called it an accident, and Ruth had never been able to prove otherwise and had spent every night since wondering if she'd buried a husband or a warning. And Nathaniel listened to all of it without interrupting, which she had come to understand was simply how he listened, and when she finished he said only that he believed her, plainly, without needing convincing, and that belief landed on her harder than any comfort he could have performed instead. It was 2 weeks after that, when Wallace Calder rode into the yard himself, mid-afternoon, 2 men behind him for effect, and asked Nathaniel with false pleasantness whether he knew he was harboring a woman with an unsettled claim. And Nathaniel said he knew he was housing a widow and her son, and whatever claim needed settling could be settled through the land office in Cedar Junction like everything else in the territory. And Wallace said the land office had already seen his paperwork, papers showing Daniel's debts against him at the time of his death, debts that by rights transferred the claim to the nearest solvent kin, meaning Wallace, and Ruth came out onto the porch at that point with Sam's hand in hers and said, in a voice that didn't shake nearly as much as she expected it to, that those debts had been paid in full the spring before Daniel died, and she had the receipt, kept, folded inside the family Bible that had, unlike the wagon, survived the fire because she'd carried it on her own person the whole 6-day walk to Nathaniel's ranch, without once mentioning why, and she went inside and came back with it and set it in Wallace's hand herself, and watched him read it, and watched his face do the arithmetic of a man realizing his best lever had just been taken out of his hand in front of 2 witnesses he'd brought along specifically to watch him win. And Nathaniel said, quiet but entirely certain, that if Wallace wanted to pursue the claim further he was welcome to do so in front of Judge Holloway on Monday, and that the judge, who Nathaniel had known for 11 years, tended not to look kindly on men who burned wagons with children still standing near them. And that last part wasn't in any document. It was simply a fact Nathaniel intended to make sure the judge heard regardless of what paper Wallace brought with him, and Wallace looked at the receipt, and at Nathaniel, and at Ruth standing square in her own doorway with her son's hand in hers and no fear left in her face that he could use against her, and he got back on his horse without another word, and rode out, and the 2 men who'd come to watch him win rode out considerably more slowly behind him, and that was the last anyone at the ranch ever saw of Wallace Calder. That evening Ruth sat on the porch step with the Bible in her lap, and Nathaniel came and sat beside her, leaving the same careful distance he always left, and she said she hadn't been sure until that afternoon that she'd ever stop being someone people tried to take things from. And Nathaniel said, that wasn't a thing that stopped on its own. It stopped when somebody stood next to you long enough that trying stopped being worth the trouble. And Ruth looked at him and said that sounded like a roundabout way of saying something else, and Nathaniel admitted that it was. And the 2 of them sat, with that admission between them, for a long quiet minute while the light went down gold over the pasture, and it was another month before he said the rest of it properly. On a Sunday with Sam off chasing the dog through the stubble field and the whole valley gone still and blue in the early evening, when Nathaniel took off his hat the way his father had taught him a man does when he means something all the way through, and said her name, and said that he'd built this house for one kind of life, and had spent 3 years alone in it, learning to want a different one without knowing what it looked like, and that he knew now, and asked her plainly if she would stay not as a woman he'd taken in but as his wife. And Ruth, who had spent her whole life being useful to people who never asked what she wanted, sat with the question for exactly as long as it took to be sure she wasn't answering out of gratitude, and then said yes, because she meant it and not because she owed him anything. and Nathaniel said that was the only kind of yes he'd have taken. They married in Cedar Junction in the spring, with the widow Anders from the Mercantile sitting in the front pew, telling anyone who'd listened that she'd known since October, since the day she saw Nathaniel Pierce carry a boy's currying brush out to the barn like it was the most natural thing in the world, and Sam stood beside them through the whole ceremony holding the family Bible with both hands like it was something that needed guarding, which in a way it was. And years later, when people in the valley told the story of how the Pierce Ranch came to have 3 people living in a house built for 2, they always told it as a story about a fire on a ridge. But Ruth, when she told it herself, always said the fire wasn't really where it started. It started on the morning she found the flour moved and realized someone had finally built a kitchen around the shape of her, instead of asking her to shrink to fit somebody else's. And that, she said, was the first day she let herself believe she might get to stay.